So in his death penalty seminar, Jacques Derrida expounds on the legal rationale offered in Plato's laws for Socrates' condemnation to death, focusing on this passage. I will read it. So if he, the ambassador, seems to have returned corrupted, let him keep company with no one, neither young man nor old, in his pretense of wisdom. If he obeys the rulers, let him live as a private citizen. If not, let him die. If he is convicted in the law court for illicit interference in education and the laws. And Derrida observes, the council, the syllagos, receives visitors, consultants, observers, experts returning from abroad, where they went to study the customs and laws of other countries. Well, if one of them comes back spoiled or corrupted, if he continues to make a display of his false wisdom, to refer willy-nilly to foreign models, and if he does not obey the magistrate, quote, he shall have sentence of death if the court convicts him of illicit interference in any matter of education or legislation. Once the court of justice has proved that he is intervening wrongly on behalf of the foreigner in the formation of the youth and the formation of the laws, he is punished with death. In addition to revealing how the stranger, and by extension the teacher-translator, held responsible for imparting foreign ideas becomes criminalized, this moment in the laws illuminates core principles of Athenian democracy, political justice, and legal custom. The phrase, and this is, imagine me having to do this next to Stathis, periten paidein kai tous nomos. Can you correct that, please?
No, it's fine.
Which focuses on the infraction of illicit interference or intervening wrongly, refers to a political subject who, on the one hand, ignores the virtue of political usefulness and behavior of the proper citizen, extolled by Thucydides in the funeral oration of Pericles, for example, and on the other hand, traduces the ideal of aristocratic non-interference, conventionally associated with Odysseus, when, as Plato recounts in the myth told by in the final book of the Republic, his soul chooses to be reborn into a life without public involvement, as, quote, one lying off somewhere that had been neglected by the others. A footnote by Peggy Kamoff, the translator of Derrida's seminar, indicates how the Greek phrase becomes a translation flashpoint. She says, in this quotation, Derrida has significantly modified the published French translation by substituting d'ingérence illicite, rendered here as illicit interference, for de s'immiscer, interfering. A.E. Taylor translates this as meddling. The Penguin edition of the Laws, translated by Trevor Saunders, also has meddling. Meddling connotes the character of the busybody, whose latter-day equivalent might be the lobbyist, or the quasi-seditious politician like Speaker John Boehner, who smugly defended his interference in foreign policy with his invitation to the Israeli Prime Minister to speak to a joint session of Congress by claiming that it was necessary because when it comes to terrorism, the president is trying to act like it's not there. Meddling falls not wide of the mark of the French verb s'immiscer, meaning to get mixed up in, to fiddle with, selected by Plato's French translator, Auguste Diez, in the edition that Derrida used. But Derrida wants to ramp up with something stronger than meddling, or at least in addition to it. As Kay Gabriel points out, quote, the Greek word that Derrida retranslates as ingérence illicite is palupragmonon, from which the palupragmon, the figure of the busybody, is derived. This busybody runs active interference to the point of threatening Athenian justice, and thus making sense of the moment in Plato's Republic, where Socrates defines justice as to do one's own task and not to polyprogmonein. While the Republic may run counter to a lot of civic ideology of Athenian democracy, it remains evident that polyprogmonein is a condemnable offense, It violates the principle of usefulness by implying political involvement in all the wrong ways. It's an impediment to the exercise of power, and at worst, it exposes power's arbitrary basis. Ingérence captures the full thrust of the negative, referring to one who forces him or herself on the polity. Obstruction of justice, sedition, government shutdown, all these threats to the demos flow out from the term. In its broadest description, ingérence spans, and this is really my kind of free-for-all, and please, I'm sure some of you will take issue with it, spans dirigisme, top-down administration, state autocracy, and in the sense of the French ingérence étatique, political inoperability, including désœuvrement, blockage, work stop, direct action, the politics of autonomia, and the impact of the pharmacon, the parasitic host, which introduced into the system functions like interferon, a compound of protein molecules released by host cells to block viral replication, whose bad side effects include the triggering of autoimmune disorders. From Derrida's retranslation of a French translation of Plato's Greek phrase, we thus move full throttle into what it means to run interference, from micro-political acts of parliamentary obstructionism to civil disobedience, to die-ins, cyber attacks, and catastrophes of autoimmunity. Each of these political takedowns is connected to education, specifically to Socrates' dialogic pedagogy and skepticism towards the educational status quo. As a teacher, Socrates is a paleoprogmenon par excellence, even if, as the Republic attests, he's on record opposing interference in affairs of state. So there's a contradiction there. From the gaps and jumps in translation, from the effort required to reconstruct what is not translated, a greater appreciation of the politics of interference comes to the fore. I think of it as a political theory of the impolitic crossed with subversive pedagogy, itself arising directly out of translation trouble, which, on a purely linguistic level, is of course a form of interference with texts, laws of grammar and logic, protocols of the political, and grooved ways of thinking, articulating, and socially comporting. In what follows, I want to delve further into translation trouble as a way of theorizing political interference. The editor of the Dictionary of Untranslatables, with whom Jacques Lesler and I worked, Barbara Cassin, has an expression for translation trouble. She calls it philosophizing in languages. In the ensemble of her writings on the pre-Socratics and the Sophists, she developed the construct of the intraduisible, the untranslatable, to point up the instability of meaning and sense-making, the equivocity of homonymy and amphiboly, the performative dimension of discursive sophistic effects, the risks and rewards of what she calls consistent relativism. Cassin gives herself over to a praxis that involves relinquishing the hold of words and conceptual networks and symptomologies that emerge when we keep on not translating. For Cassin, the step from this point involves entering the labyrinth of Lacanian sophistry, a psychoanalytic doxography in which nonsense and nonsense are both an incontrovertible core of signifying practices that elicit rhetorical workarounds. Psychoanalysis becomes a linguistic process philosophy, present and perpetual. Following Cassin, I have defined the untranslatable not as the name of a concept, but as a dual practice of theoretical interference and workaround, as a praxis of cognizing philologically, deconstructively, and politically. The starting point consists of particularities of translational resistance that account for text's singular unreadability, an effect duly noted in the case of Plato's Laws, for example, by Trevor Saunders when he says, Plato's Greek in the Laws is difficult, emphatic yet imprecise, elaborate yet careless, prolix yet curiously elliptical. The meaning is often obscure and the translator is forced to turn interpreter. How should such an extraordinary text be rendered into English? Any translation which preserved every note of the original would be doomed to failure, more surely in the case of the laws than of almost any other classical text. It would be quite unreadable. So here you see that the untranslatable imposes an exigent relation, a particularly exigent relation on the translator. It makes impossible demands. It brings the translation to the brink of failure, or brooks that failure in translations that never materialize. In a forthcoming review in the London Review of Books of this dictionary of untranslatables, Christopher Prendergast takes issue with the whole concept of untranslatable. He notes that the English editors had chosen to foreground the term, and, but thinks it's a red herring. He says it's a term that conservative fundamentalists like. It puts up barriers and ring fences cultures. What is it doing here? A short and uncharitable answer is not very much. Apter claims it is by no means self-evident what untranslatability means, but that's far from being self-evidently the case. Untranslatable normally means exactly what it says, that which cannot be translated. And he goes on, I won't read the whole thing. Now, while I take these criticisms seriously and wouldn't deny that much of what is at stake with the untranslatable concerns the navigation of what he characterizes as hits and mishits, convergences and divergences, continuities and breaks, incomplete and imperfect translation, or even plain vanilla translation, I'm not convinced he grasps what an untranslatable is, mostly because I think he fails to appreciate what it does or is capable of doing. And as I'll try to elaborate, the untranslatable is distinguished by distinct abilities, which I borrow that use of abilities from Sam Weber's Benjaminian formula. Not a reified essence of linguistic singularity or simple remainder. It refers to how concepts assimilate actually existing ways of speaking and being, and how actually existing ways of speaking and being interfere with concepts. Simple thing, but I think often we tend to treat concepts as transhistorical, and even in the rubric of the political concepts, it's very hard to kind of avoid that pitfall of its sort of abstractedness. The untranslatable should certainly not be cast as a fundamentalism, a term charged with Islamophobic overtones, not to mention complicity with the intolerant politics of the Christian right. While the untranslatable might well be taken as proscriptive, its apodictic force is hardly reducible to a defense of fundamentalism, universal dogma, political absolutism, or censorship. Rather, at least as I see it, it gestures towards what Ayman el-Dasuki has specified in relation to more uniquely Islamic hermeneutics found in Islamic traditions of discontinuous verse, the charismatic or proclamatory mode of access to the spoken word, which in a sense short-circuits things and creates a kind of interference. The ontotheological dimension associated with charisma has led me to investigate untranslatability as a characteristic of modes of ununderstandability, Unverständlichkeit, in situations of cultural forcing and border conflict. More generally, I see it as a rubric for categories like the not translated, the non-equivalent, and the incommensurable. But the latter, dismissed by Prendergast as an outdated anthropological idea of intractable alterity, used to reinforce reciprocally unintelligible conceptual universes. And while I think he's right to encourage wariness towards non-coevalness in cultural comparison, he seems curiously unconcerned by the tendency embedded in the neoliberal humanities curriculum, especially in its made-for-export versions, to assume that, say, all literatures are translatable and subject to the same kinds of laws of equivalence that one might find in programs of economic adjustment or the theory of the general equivalent. So recently I've been experimenting with how to do things with political untranslatables, which are of course everywhere, sometimes assigned considerable weight in political analysis, even when their status as untranslatables isn't philosophically or critically unpacked. Consider, for example, how the word occupy, tainted with the connotations of colonial occupation or with polluting and violent resource extraction, was revalued by Occupy Wall Street. Something similar happened to the word zone in French, normally associated with zones of a detention detention, camps or prisons, but transfigured by the acronym ZAD, Zone à Défendre, often used as a synonym for squatting in fallow property or for actions against environmentally damaging construction projects. Consider too Maidan, the Ukrainian term for central square, which in its philology connects Arabic, Greek, and Ukrainian notions of public politics. It is site-specific, yet connected transpolitically to places of assembly and occupation all over the world where insurrection is erupting. Tahrir, Taksim, Puerto del Sol, Zuccotti Park, Ogawa Plaza in Oakland, the list goes on. It designates a particular instance of competing nationalisms in Eastern Europe, as well as strategic solidarity among regionally, ethnically, and religiously conflictive groups. It's a lodestone of language politics, as well as a breakout scene of sexual politics, with feminists and LGBT volunteers well represented in hospitals and emergency hotlines during the demonstrations. The sexual politics are a particularly important feature, I think, of its difficult to translate quality, for as we know, gay bashing in Russia is part of this Kremlin-backed effort to galvanize anti-pro-European Union factions, prompting groups that might otherwise be strongly critical of Western neoliberalism to strategically endorse it. And so the Maidan political map is configured unpredictably according to its case-sensitive retranslation. And in this way, we see key words inflected by language. Even as I said, most dictionaries of philosophy tend to forget this politics of translation in adopting transhistorical approaches to concepts. Very interesting, for example, in the dictionary, the entry on Pravda, where they note that it is until, at least in many of the dictionaries of Russian philosophical lexicons, the word Pravda had been excised because it was so associated with the newspaper. It had, in a sense, been de-philosophized. And so the whole question of where a term is sort of exhausted and then becomes a philosophy again, shows you this sort of traces of the political, of political activism on, or political conditions on the status of philosophical terms. The transiting of Maidan to unfixed forms and sites of global interference, ranging from resistance to oligarchic repression to anti-capitalist pushback, reminds us that political glossaries and lexicons have a historic role in opposition politics. I'm thinking here specifically of the glossary that Althusser's English translator Ben Brewster appended to the book Pour Marx, The Four Marx, which then was reprised in Reading Capital. Terms like alienation, epistemological break, conjuncture, you know the list, they project an encapsulated political program. And it's perhaps for this reason that Althusser gave them such close attention. He writes to Brewster, "Thank you for your glossary. What you've done is extremely important from a political, educational, theoretical point of view. I return your text with a whole series of corrections and interpolations, some of which are fairly long and important. You will see why." So his activation of theory in the form of an interfered with glossary of his own critical lexicon also brought to mind Alain Badiou's recent philosophical lexicon of riots and uprisings in The Rebirth of History, Le Réveil de l'Histoire, his response to Arab Spring. Badiou proceeds through a tripartite typology. The first is immediate riot, defined as a tumultuous assembly of the young, characterized by weak localization, a lack of distinction between universalizable intention and random rage, between demonstrating and pillaging. The second is latent or pre-political riot, marked by a qualitative extension out from the local. And the example given is the emergence of a single slogan endorsed by disparate voices, Mubarak, clear off. Thus is created, he says, the possibility of a victory, since what is immediately at stake in the riot has been decided. The movement can persist in anticipation of a specific material satisfaction, the departure of a man whose name, a short while before taboo, but now publicly condemned to ignominious erasure, is brandished. The third type is historical riot, and it's closest to reaching the bar of what Badiou recognizes as the event. The event is, as you know, really an advent, the emergence of an intervallic period that reboots the revolutionary sequence by nullifying the natural harmony between unbridled capitalism and impotent democracy. That's his expression. For the riot to become historical, it must become political, which is to say, embody the subjective sharing of an idea and manifest that, quote, the inexistent has arisen. It must, as it turns out, run interference in the affairs of state. And I think this is a key moment in the text, where he reprises Mao's injunction issued during the Cultural Revolution, get involved in the affairs of state, but he remakes it into a slogan for the new times of insurrection via fragment 2 of René Char's poem, Feuilles d'Hypnose, where one line rings out as a rallying cry. Don't linger in the rut of results. Ne tarde pas à l'ornière des résultats. One might keep on translating this line as gum up the works of affairs of state, dare to interfere, commit the crime of pollupragmanine. With each act of translation, from political event to event glossary, from poetry to call to arms, the lexicon of historical riot joins the language of the poets in answer to the query about how to translate the untranslatable, which is posed at the very opening of Badiou's book. He says, what is happening to us in the early years of the century, something that would appear not to have any clear name in any accepted language. Badiou will adopt a similar position, politics of retracting the names of accepted language in the communist hypothesis, as he distinguishes 4 typologies of May 68. And of particular urgency, of course, is the need to recall the word communism from its derisive and corrupted usage in circulation in most of the West, thus returning to it its signification prime as a word equal to egalitarianism and coincident with the reauthorized right to words and expressions like the people, workers, the abolition of private property. He wants to, in a sense, recapture those words from their disuse, their stigma. The recourse, then, to political untranslatables in this instance is not, as it is with Cassin, a matter of creating political solidarity in and through philosophizing in languages, but a labor of rescuing radical political philology from the censors. I won't belabor that. I will sort of give one more example before I begin to conclude. Ayman El-Dessouky, who I previously cited, works this political untranslatable as well in a kind of different way in his scansion of the early days of the Egyptian Revolution. He calls it the Amara on the Square, a term with a long history. It comes back in the context of Tahrir in the name for the conflation of political connective agency with aesthetic practice. And I will not read it, it's really too long, but you can have a look. Referring to Badiou, El-Dessouky extends the auguring force of the expression by the Amara of to something hitherto untheorized, associated by Badiou with movement communism and by Slavoj Žižek with a new political reality posed against ideological objective reality. Unlike movement communism or new political reality, however, Amara is less aporetic, I would argue. Its contents are substantiated with specific aesthetic practices accessed on the oblique of Arabic philology, and that's what's worked out in that passage, if you want to follow that. Speaking of aporetic politics, let me conclude with some comments on Žižek, and more specifically on Žižek's expression or use of a term, Bartleby politics, as a term referring to a consummate politics of interference, akin to stonewalling all questions that beg their response, or beg the question. Quote, we can imagine the varieties of such a gesture in today's public space. Not only the obvious, there are great chances of a new career here, join us, I would prefer not to. Or, are you aware of how our environment is endangered, do something for ecology, I would prefer not to. Or what about all the racial and sexual injustices that we witness all around us? Isn't it time to do more? I would prefer not to. And he says, he calls this, Bartleby's phrase, the gesture of subtraction at its purest. The reduction of all qualitative differences to a purely formal, minimal difference. That's his phrase. For Zizek, Bartleby's gesture of withdrawal is no mere no of resistance as such, nor simply a distance taking from the what is of politics, preparatory to a new alternative order. It is rather a parallax shift, aphoretically manifest as, quote, what remains of the supplement to the law when its place is emptied of all its obscene superego content. And it is an assertion of resistance to, again, his wonderful phrase, the Rumspringe of resistance, all the forms of resisting which help the system to reproduce itself by ensuring our participation in it. Today, says Zizek, I would prefer not to, is not primarily not to participate in the market economy, in capitalist competition and profiteering, but much more problematically, and this joins some of the issues raised in the discussion of Miriam's paper, much more problematically, I would prefer not to give to charity, to support a black orphan in Africa, engage in the struggle to prevent oil drilling in a wildlife swamp, etc. So, in other words, this opting out of bien-pensant liberalism, this intractable imperviousness to any form of hegemonic interpolation, is a formal gesture indicative for Zizek of the symbolic order's collapse. It founders on the holophrastic signifier turned object, embodied in I would prefer not to, and thrives on the violence inhering in inert, impassive being. I think of Simone Weil. And if I've taken a moment to rehearse Zizek's three principles of Bartleby politics, subtraction, the aporia of the legal supplement, and the formal gesture of refusal as symptom of the demise of the symbolic order, it is in part because they claim the empty formal gesture for a non-optimized, non-instrumentalized, unaccounted for ontology, or even notion of political citizenship. But the aporia leaves me hungering for a different kind of meddling in affairs of state. Retreating the political, living passively and resistantly, abstaining by withholding, waiting into worklessness, all these strategies undo neoliberal pieties and flush out the new hegemons lurking in the names for new activisms. Moreover, the aporetic political, espoused in divergent ways by Derrida, Nancy, Agamben, Negri, Badiou, Esposito, and Zizek, and many others, models a rigorous right of refusal that can be downright aspirational. But what, in my view, still remains unformulated or insufficiently potentialized is a translational politics of the concept, a politics of interference and ingérence illicite. Thank you.
Okay, floor is open. Want some questions? Jay?
Sure. So a small worry in your conversation with Badiou. You said, or maybe it was he said, matters which, that in the attempt to do a proper philology of communism, you wanted to rescue radical politics from the philology of the censors.
Rescue certain terms like communism, proletariat. Yeah,
right.
Yeah. That's
And
he says that. Yeah.
He says rescue from the censors. The censors are history and memory. They're not people. They are all our memory of actual existing communism. And it seems to me there's a kind of crazy idealism here, which is an unwillingness to think that we can rescue every term. Maybe, the philology may be true, but maybe the term is dead anywhere. And what we have to do instead is invent new concepts and new ideas. Why do we think that philology, rather than creation, is a better form of interference? So A, I worry about the censor when it's really memory he's talking about. There's no censor, there's just memory. And B, a preference for backward-looking philology rather than forward-looking creation. I just thought there's a bizarre politics in that Badgerian structure.
Well, first of all, I don't see philology as backward at all.
His is. If that's his move,
Well,
then it is.
I may have overlaid the term philology on him. He doesn't really use that. He's interested in certainly rescuing communism. I'm sorry. Certainly he's interested in rescuing the word communism, right? That's he's not the sole mover on that front. And you could arguably say that is precisely that. I mean, his defense probably would be that because he would acknowledge the captation of communism by a terrible history. He's not in denial about that. He's in a sense saying, though, that the term was created and never was allowed to in a sense, create what it was supposed to. So you don't necessarily need a new concept. And I mean, I would also turn this around to you and say...
Can you say something about the relation between term and concept?
Yes.
A term is a word.
Yes.
A concept is a set of meanings. They're not the same at all.
No, they're not. And I think, this is I've written a lot about that. I think and I won't kind of do too much of it, but the term is precisely an attack on the concept, really, because terms are much more porous, much more responsive to historical circumstance, for better or for worse. They are, in a sense, what the whole Cassanian project was trying to substitute lexically and not do this kind of transhistorical philology of the concept. The concept also is very deeply implicated in predication and nominalism, in certain kinds of discursive logics that hierarchize in certain ways. I'm not saying the term totally gets around that, but they are much more, they are arguably less hegemonic, especially if one makes a concerted effort to, and they are terms in the sense of they have temporality built into them. They can become obsolescent, they can come back. They are more, in a sense, dynamical in terms of the rhythms of living and dying, or of stretching and shrinking. They have, at least this is, so interminability, finitude, that's very much, for me, part of the politics of the term. I'm not saying you couldn't find this in the concept, but I think it's in its very kind of terminological structure, and so, yeah, more could be said about that. So, yeah, let me be careful here and say that I think we are talking about the reclamation and reactivation of terms rather than concepts per se.
So thank you, Emma, that was really great. And I have a question for you really about, I want to ask you if you could just say a little bit, I'm sorry. I just want to ask you if you could say a little bit more maybe about Derrida in this. And the reason I'm asking that is because you put him on both sides of the divide in a way. Divide is maybe too strong for what you're doing, but you have the sort of Bartleby passivity or opting out move at the end that you articulate. And earlier when you were talking about, which you're obviously to some extent opposing, using some of the vocabulary that you took from the original translation of the translation from Plato to Semizé. And then, but en route to that, you were talking about the apparatic, non-political, and the sort of large and varied group of people that are associated with that, that runs from Derrida to Zizek and a whole bunch of other people that you listed. And so that sort of put Derrida on both sides. You know,
yes.
He's the thinker of the Semizé, but he's also the thinker of the apparatic, non-political.
Mm-hmm.
The Bartleby, you know, that gets nominally named Bartleby here, but it's not necessarily. And you know, so I want to know, because I'm thinking about these things too. I admit I have a selfish intent to some extent, but I want to know how you think about him. I think he's the only one on the list who occupies both sides so firmly.
Yes.
So can I ask you to comment on that?
That's a fantastic question, and in a sense, it's you're fleshing out a kind of predilection for Derrida on my part, because I do think, and I haven't thought this through, but maybe he is ultimately for me the person who takes me to both places. The way he questions force of law, but then, he'll take a term like shibboleth, and he will immediately talk about it in terms of the policing of the moment. Derrida, as we know, in every seminar starts with the here and now. He allows the situation to come in and immediately inflect the topic at hand, the moment. There are sometimes interruptions or disturbances, right, that occur. And I think I actually put him in with Althusser in that respect, that there is this kind of dream of the effectivity of the structure where something comes in to disturb the actual articulation. That he has this, in the long thing on overdetermination, this gets worked out in other places too. And I think that maybe I'm picking up on these moments where, sure, Derrida joins the apparetic camp. I mean, my God, it's, and that's in some ways why I kind of got burned out with Derrida. I couldn't do the aporia anymore. I just couldn't do it. And no one can do the aporia. I just got stuck in it and wanted to be in another place. But so this kind of, what he does to me is he opens up. There's always some instability, and it's often through these slippages, this translation. He's obsessed with translation. Why? This is where I think this kind of actual something happens to concepts. That's where the interference occurs, and where it also enters a realm of politics small p, which is not just the theory of the political in the classical sense, but where some kind of empirical pragmatic politics of the everyday walks into philosophy and affects the status of the philosophy. Maybe I'm more comfortable with the kind of revisionist philosophy than I am either term or concept, but yeah.
I think maybe what's interesting there to think about is whether there's a relationship in Derrida between the apparatic and the soumise in a way that's lacking in the other theorists of the apparatic, rather than choosing the good Derrida against the bad Derrida, as it were. You know, to think about how, and that translation is one word for their mutuality. That's
Thank
what,
you.
Okay?
That's great, yeah. Oh, we can turn this off. Sweat bath.
Don't take that quote away, I need it.
Other one.
She wants that quote.
She wants to be the...
Oh, well,
yeah.
no, it's okay.
Now it's not going to work, because by the time it reboots these things...
Oh, I'm sorry, you wanted one of the citations?
No, it's okay, actually. I didn't memorize it. No, it's okay. My question is very naive, I think, in this respect. In thinking about the difference between concepts and terms, I thought one of the things you're going to do with the word interference, given what you'd said about the word occupation and occupy, was actually to go into a performative mode and start to talk about acts. And in the Egyptian imaginary, it goes from this term and into attitudinal things, into directional things. But the last thing it engages is the notion of people doing performances in the square and acting. And I thought interference, thinking also back to Socrates, this idea of walking and being in a square and being in public spaces, that the performativity of your concept got a bit, or your term and your concept got a bit lost. And there would be some way of bringing that back in, particularly for your concept, in contrast to some of the others today.
I have an artist friend who I often try out things with, and she she's been thinking a lot about the notion of virtuosity, that maybe we could add that to political concepts.
Well, that one I mean, that's a really big one in my field. But I don't know quite, it is a kind of interference, but it's also not interference. The interference has got to be a cutting, a breakage in something.
Right.
In a way.
A reordering, a redirecting, a...
Yeah, the change of direction, which virtuosity doesn't always capture.
No, totally. I just meant the way she was thinking of it as something that, I mean, it wasn't that profound, but there is, it comes back to a lot of the discussions of aesthetic performativity and art practice as a form of the political. And
if you were talking about, say, civil disobedience, aesthetic
yeah.
disobedience, and so on, you really can't do without the performativity inside the concept of the terms. And it just seems that there's some political concepts that really demand that, and I think interference is one of them. In a way, occupy is too. It doesn't exist without this really active side, apart from challenging the very idea of what an occupation is, which is what I thought part of it was about downtown.
Well, you're helping me now because I became fixated, and I couldn't bring it into the paper, but on this notion of the pasquinade, which is a form of parody, and I looked it up, and it's the name used by the Romans since the early modern period to describe a battered Hellenistic-style statue dating to the 3rd century, which was unearthed in a district of Rome in the 15th century. Its fame dates to the 16th century when Cardinal Olivero Carafa draped the torso of the statue in a toga and decorated it with Latin epigrams on the occasion of St. Mark's Day. And the name comes from just this random funny man who was a barber named Pasquino. And they have now, it's become a whole tradition near this statue, this mutilated statue, where pamphlets and performances, and I noticed that in one of the political blogs that someone talked about Sarah Palin as doing an ignominious pasquinade. And I'm thinking, okay, I've got to theorize that somehow. You know? And now I think you're giving me the way.
What a smart creep there.
Oh, great. Okay. Anyway, I completely agree with you on that in a longer version that would be nice to develop. And actually, that's one thing that Cassin really develops in the way she works with it. So, yeah.
I want to return to Derrida, but also return to the question or the concept of what a lexicon is. And this is more of an observation, but maybe you can say something more, but how different in this regard Derrida is from Badiou or Balibar or whoever. But because a lexicon was the very thing that Derrida absolutely refused to produce or have produced. So his terms, it's not a question of salvaging old names. It's a question of his new names, which he's putting into effect, and his refusal to let them be put into a handbook. And so what and his career is just multiplied. That the older he gets, there's this chain of names are trailing behind him, which become which circulate almost as equivalents. This or this or this or this or this, but not quite.
Trace, Hyman.
Yeah, and they just become with every year there's this kind of bigger collection of names, but no lexicon, and for a number of reasons. But it seems to me one of the reasons has to do with his idea of pedagogy. So unlike a pedagogy, a kind of possibly an authoritarian pedagogy, however populist it looks, which provides handbooks giving you the terms, there's something about the insistence on using names, using words so they don't become proper names, so they don't become fixed in that particular way. And the lexicon in this regard seems to vacillate between a museum, which would just canonize and embalm words, but also, speaking of parody and the sort of the way in which lexicons so often are comic devices which trivialize. You pick up a dictionary and these, it becomes a list which becomes funny somehow. So I just wanted to see if you have any comments, but specifically on pedagogy in this regard.
I mean, there's in some ways a kind of critical art form of recapturing the study guide questionnaire, the dictionary, the vocabulary, the academic armature of pedagogy and transmission, knowledge transmission, encyclopedias of that whole totalizing gesture, which honestly has become more and more problematic. I think this is another kind of pet peeve of mine, but I think that I'm not against data mining or use of digital humanities. And I think actually for some project like the one I worked on, it could be quite useful. But it's an implied language of instrumentalization. If you look at its etymology, it's very dependent on management language and on the extractive industries like mining and clear cutting, and that's the source of its language. Well, Derrida today would be writing something on that, I know, because he has a sort of critique of the monolingualism of the language of knowledge all the way through, and that's one of the subversive effects of his pedagogy, I think, is that the very thing that obfuscates, that sends off on this path and doesn't arrive at the point, it's non-instrumental. There's often something driving it. Many things are. And that's still, to me, absolutely at the source of this, of its political force, really, of its political potentiality. And it's why I think of it as a translational way of thinking, not so much a theory of translation or even a specific practice of it, but it's just a way of thinking that goes to the heart of what you're saying, which is that rejection of, in a sense, the more, either on the one hand, more comprehensive and organized, managed approach to knowledge transmission, the doxa, and on the other, something that's considered over here the poetic, the free form, the creative over here. He refuses those divisions. And I think the whole question of, it comes back to Jay's point also about creating new. Well, I think that would be utopian. I don't think that happens really, or even necessarily should. But I think there is a creating within the field of terms or philosophemes that is absolutely as important now as ever.
Emily, I'm thinking one of the things that I realized as we were talking that I remembered is very useful in terms of this argument, Adorno's essay on the use of foreign words, where the same kind of argument of these words run interference against the presumed conceptual integrity of the language in which philosophy is written. There are words that in some ways are untranslatable, or not just they could have translation, but the point is that here is not to attempt a translation. But anyway,
we learned that almost exactly this spot.
On this, yes, right.
When you was attacked for using foreign words at Columbia.
Right.
Oh, really?
The Princeton Radio Project, yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah. But anyway, I wanted to say something about this Bartleby politics business, and of course, it's not so much, it's directed more at Zizek than obviously you, but you are using it. And the thing about the Bartleby politics, I can understand the logic behind it when it is used in order to run interference against the command obedience structure. Okay, that's its significance, is to in some ways dismantle the instrumentality of a command obedience structure by simply not even refusing, right? Not even refusing, not saying even no. But it's a disastrous political platform the moment you step out of the command obedience structure, where you have to make decisions in the void in many ways, and where it seems to me that in that case, the affirmation of decision is what runs interference. So this is not, of course, your thing because it's Zizek's thing, but the concept has to be I don't know, contextualized in the argument in terms of the fact that it only means interference in a very specific structure, and its political use is really not that great outside that structure. Presumably, it's the politics outside that structure that Zizek is aspiring to, and that's, you know, not helping him in any way.
I agree.
Yes, Dimitri. Yeah. No, it wasn't. Yeah.
Right, I want to make 2 points. One is in reference to what Jace said. I think it's really very, very good point that the sensor is memory. So the censorship really occurs in memory, and I take it that this is also a response to Albach's, to his idea of collective memory, because for him we only remember collectively, never individually. But for him it's always a restoration of the true meanings, it's not the suppression of certain meanings. So I think it's really very good and valid point, which I take it comes mostly from Hegel. But Albach was responding to Durkheim, his idea of collective memory. Anyway, but I take it that in that particular text you were referring to Badiou, that's my guess. Badiou, as for example, also Rancia, the name of history, in fact refers to Mao, to the idea of revolution, which he takes from Confucius. It goes straight out of the Analects, that revolution is the restoration of the names. And it uses two signs restoring names, and that's what a revolution is. So revolution is really the restoration of the concepts, of the set of meanings that were somehow muddled or obscured by history, by bourgeois way of life, and we need to restore it. So I think this is, so thank you, I think it's a very, very good point really. And then I have a question for Emily. So I wonder whether what you describe as interference is not the same as Roti describes by strong reading, or strong misreading. Because the concept comes from Harold Bloom in his early works, where he discusses modernistic poetry, and he says that it's so obscure anyway, so that we need to provide strong misreadings of the text in order to make some sense of them. But then Roti appropriates this idea from Harold Bloom and says that we need to provide intentional, strong textual misreadings of certain texts, so to interfere with them on purpose. And so I wonder whether this is, in fact, the same that you've been describing by your notion of concept of interference.
I guess the problem of the Bloom analogy, and maybe it's when my kind of coming of age or formation, is that it was articulated so much in terms of the strong poet and the Oedipal model of killing the father, and, you know, Blake was talking to Milton, and, you know, the story. It was somehow a narrative that was so inscribed in a kind of, in a sense, a discussion among the legislators of the canon. And so it didn't let anyone else in. So I wouldn't want to just sort of just run with misreading. Misreading is coded for me very much in this kind of Bloomian framework in terms of anxiety of influence and that agon, the Oedipal agon, and I don't want all that baggage. I'm not saying it couldn't be relevant, but it would be constraining for me. And I'm looking really in terms of something else, not necessarily to go back to some of the classic ideas of literary theory, almost pre-deconstruction at that point, but to see how this kind of slightly more general notion of it's not just mistranslation, it's retranslation, it's constant translation, it's terms that are translated all the time because there's some irritant in them that refuses to go away, or people are just attracted or drawn. There's something that, like a bug that gets inside. So I don't want to confine this just to simply misreading or and also reading now is again another very freighted thing. It's the lexicographic orientation of so much. Whereas I'm really interested in sort of an opening of the philosophy of interference in this sense here that I began with, that Derrida's picking up more in relation to a larger notion of which I spoke on, did my first tryout on here a few years ago, and some notion of the impolitic, of unexceptional politics that refuses to fall into the choice of either the apparetic communitas that's always to come, or the what works, and which is being constantly tabbed as futile, capital O, parliamentarianism. I mean, I think I'm interested in these things that go both ways on the left and right, and that make it very complicated, but I think are essential to talk about together. The other one is obstruction, right, and certain kinds of rudeness that we're seeing all the time in terms of maneuvering. And it's I don't think this is just a kind of incidental thing in contemporary political life. I think there's something that's really a larger structural problem of being. It's not just that there's a standoff between the Democrats and the Republicans. There's something about the unleashing of a kind of imprecation, of a tirade, of taking down, and it raises a lot of these kind of historical close ties between, say, interference as anonymous, right, as jamming the system, as hacking, and also, this supreme kind of racist refusal to observe the most minimal codes of procedure and respect in political process. That there's this kind of, on either side, there's something going on with obstruction, with impolitic kind of forms of the political, some of which are exciting and some of which are devastating. But I think they are in the realm of politics and not the political. So I guess what I'm strategically trying to do here is use some of the resources of kind of philosophy and theory to get to something, to either confront those impasses or try to find other terms that might be reworked for them. But because I think they address something about what's happening politically that other terms are not in classical political theory, or in some of the great stuff that's still being published and read on the left. I read it, I'm enormously attentive to it, but I also think that I just don't want to feel that it's always foreclosed, in terms of the contemporary political process that's streaming around us all the time, and it's either takes the form of, say, Balibar will talk about Europe today, and it's circumscribed in some way where he steps out of doing the theory of citizenship, and it's not that they're unrelated, but there are kind of two different modes, and I don't know. It seems like an awful lot can't be articulated if one sticks to certain terms of classical political theory. I guess that's my point.